Shalom, welcome to another episode of Hebrew in Israel and Pirke Avot, the wisdom writings of the sages. And last time we started off with a discussion on the basis of how Rabbinic Judaism in its earliest stages perceived itself as a continuation of Moshe through Yoshua, the elders, the prophets, surprisingly not the Kohanim, not the priests, which, as I mentioned, was probably an issue for Rabbinic Judaism because it technically took away from the priesthood its position of Torah authority, as the Torah actually describes it. And with the transition away from a temple, there was a need to create a Judaism that is detached from temple service. However, ironically, the earliest sages, which are mentioned within Pirke Avot, are actually people who lived when the temple stood. And as the screen already shows you, the teaching of Shimon HaTzadik, who was a leader and maybe even possibly a Kohen who lived at the cusp of the Hellenistic era, and may have actually met Alexander the Great. The claim is that he was one of the people who met Alexander the Great when he came to the region. Historically speaking, probably not. Alexander traveled to Gaza and then to Egypt, and chances are, this is how some historians reconstruct it, he actually met, Shimon actually met one of the generals, and not Alexander the Great himself. But Shimon HaTzadik is a very, very important character. He's only mentioned once or twice in rabbinic literature, once here, and then again in I think once in the Talmud as well. In other words, he's not a very, very common character because he's very, very, very early on. He predates everything imaginable. He's one of the very, very first people that the Pharisaic and then Pharisaic Judaism and then Rabbinic Judaism associates themselves to. Dating back into the Hellenistic era is very important as well because it really is when Judaism starts to become Judaism. It transitions from the earlier practices, what some scholars will call Yahwism, and yes, you can say Yahwism because it's not the correct pronunciation of the name. And I know some people will find it offensive, but again, I'm also a Bible scholar, so this is normal for us. But it's also clearly not the correct pronunciation, so I'm allowing myself to do that, and I do it publicly as well, so you have to get used to it. And the transition here to this form of Judaism is not as cut and clean as some people think. And you'll see what I mean as we go. So the first statement we have, because we're going to be doing two, Mishnah 2 and 3. Mishnah 2 says, Shimon HaTzadik haya mishirik Knesset HaGdola, hu haya omer, al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed, al ha'torah, ve'al ha'avodah, ve'al gemilut hasadim. Okay, so Shimon the righteous. This title, righteous, is a very, very unusual title, not really used anywhere else. So this is, in and by itself, a very unique situation. Was among the last of the Great Assembly. As I said last time, we're not really 100% sure what the Great Assembly is, but it's a thing. And this was probably the original Gerusia, the original assembly of elders that carried on, which means that Jerusalem, like most cities at the time, and especially cities that were in contact with the Hellenistic world, with the Persians and the Greeks, they had an assembly. They had an assembly of elders within the city. So he was probably a Jerusalemite or from the area. He was highly regarded. I think some traditions even try to place him as the high priest. And he really also marks I would argue, somewhat the end of an era for some people. If I'm not mistaken, there is a midrash that mentions that when Shimon HaTzadik died, certain miracles in the temple stopped happening. So he's used also as a demarker of some kind of a change in the world. And this is why it's probably referred to as the righteous, because he was really lost of his kind. He used to say, Hu haya omer, which is what we call a paraphrastic phrase. It's a combination of kal participle, what we call benoni, together with the verb haya omer, which means he frequently used to say this. The world stands on three things. This is the three-legged chair or table that the Greeks used to use as well, which is supposed to represent something very, very stable. On Torah, on avodah, service or worship, and on gemilut chasadim, acts of kindness. Okay, so some of the points being made here, and actually we can skip first to the historical context. So he lived somewhere around the third to fourth centuries, or fourth to third centuries. Probably was a high priest during the early Hellenistic period, likely during the transition of Persian to Greek rule in Judea, because Alexander the Great went to war. Really, the whole development there was him continuing on his father's Philippus II's work, where they were taking over the Hellenistic world, the world of the Greeks, and then first of all Greeks and Macedonians, and then it becomes Hellenistic because it becomes a combination of East and West. And his journey, he pushes the Persians further and further into the East, and he takes part of Syria, and which eventually becomes part of the Seleucian kingdom or empire. He travels down to Gaza because he wants to control the bay there, and he goes into Egypt and basically influences the entire world. I did say the following. He is traditionally associated with the strengthening Jewish identity against Greek cultural influences. This is how traditionally it's observed. This is how Judaism usually interprets this piece of history. In truth, at the time, Hellenism wasn't really a thing yet. He's used as a banner. He's used as a symbol of this concept of the last stages before everyone became Hellenistic. And that's why he's perceived this way. He didn't actively have to do this because at the time there wasn't anything of the sort. This is basically taking an historical character and putting upon him, overlapping upon him something that's ahistorical, but tries to drive a point of we're not following these types of things. He is also mentioned in Antiquities 1243. He's mentioned in Yoma 69a. Okay, these at the time, as I said here, this context helps explain the emphasis on Torah, temple service, and acts of kindness. So I'm going to actually, after this, say the following. When he says Torah, he means acts of Torah. It's later on interpreted as the study of Torah, divine wisdom, learning, and moral guidance. So these two slides overlap one another. Avodah is temple service. At his time, Avodah was literally temple service. There was nothing else. There's no discussion of Avodah as acts of doing Torah. For example, what they would do is they would say Torah is the philosophy, Avodah is the actual work of Torah. But this is an interpretation that is relevant to a period when there's no temple. So today you would say studying Torah and acting in Torah. Gemilut chasadim, this is something eternal. This is also something very human in general. Acts of kindness. Always be kind to one another, which is, by the way, my father's philosophy. My father, alav shalom, blessed memory. Alav shalom means peace upon him. He always used to preach to us to be kind to one another. This was always, especially in the last, I would say, 20 years, but it was always this thing of bring peace with one another. Never fight. When my brothers and I used to fight, he always used to talk about how is this bringing peace to the world, especially as adults. As fighting as adults has a completely different atmosphere. When kids fight, it's a fight. But when adults fight, there's an atmosphere of darkness that comes with it. And my father hated that atmosphere. And he always talked about Gemilut chasadim. He would say, how is this Gemilut chasadim to one another? Gemilut chasadim obviously expands further and further and further. But it has to be said, first of all, Gemilut chasadim has to be done within the circles of where you live. Giving charity to someone way beyond where you live is a great act of Gemilut chasadim. feed starving children in Africa and so on. Yes, sure. But if you have people starving in your neighborhood, you have to first of all take care of them. It doesn't diminish the desire to help way beyond where you live, but it has to be stated that you first of all start off with where you live because it's in front of your eyes. So when Shimon HaTzadik basically presents what he says here, he really is boiling down the Jewish world at his time, or the Judean world at his time. Okay? And the world of his time was keeping Torah, doing service at the temple, and doing acts of kindness to one another. This does actually, these statements also are very similar to things we find in other groups. For example, in Plato's Republic, we find the concept of wisdom as a philosopher king. Plato was anti-democracy, so he kind of supported the Spartan way of doing things. But what's very interesting is everyone knows the Spartans for their war behavior. What they don't know is the Spartans also were very intelligent people. The decision to become warlike had to do with survival. Yes, the Athenians were much more philosophical. Plato was a philosopher. And he was anti-democracy, but he did want people to be philosophical. So he believed in the concept of philosopher king. He also believed in the concept of courage. Courage is close to the concept of doing Torah as well. And moderation, the concept of moderation, doing Torah in a balanced way, which is actually very similar to what Kohelet states. Now, again, this is, I'm trying to compare it to the ancient world, so this is not going to be absolutely symmetrical. Philo, who lives years and years after Shimon HaTzadik, sees Torah more in a philosophical sense. This is a Jew living outside of the land. He doesn't have a temple anywhere near him, and he is also part of the Homeric school, which means everything has metaphorical meanings. If you actually read the writings of Philo, you see everything has some symbolic meaning. So for him, Torah is philosophy. Avodah is the acts of Torah. And Gemilut Chasadim is a universal concept. Gemilut Chasadim is something that all human beings should participate in. Live an ethical life, which is something that we hear a lot. So, for example, Aristotelian virtual ethics do talk about purpose in life. What is purpose in life? Doing Torah, serving at the temple, and having ethics, moral behavior with one another, kindness. Shimon HaTzadik is trying to create some kind of a foundation of who we are. At his time, Judaism was starting to kind of form itself. It was still that pre-Judaism state, but they were trying to define who they were. They were trying to define what they were. So up to this point, they were still developing the concept of scripture. At times of Shimon HaTzadik, the assumption is that Torah was already well established with a lot of people, in the format that we more or less know today. The prophets were more or less known. The book of Psalms was becoming very, very central. The Ketuvim, the writings, were still being developed. In truth, even at the time of the Maccabees, there's some suspicion that the writings were not yet solidified, so they were more liquid. Some books were more popular, some books were less popular. This is already a discussion about how things were canonized. And what he's doing is he's looking also into the bigger world, and he's saying, okay, we need to define ourselves. We need to define who we are as Judeans. And he says, what are the three things that make us Judean? The fact that we have law of the ancestors, the laws of the fathers, that's our culture. We have a temple, which all cultures at the time believed that your social life, part of your social life centers around your ancestral worship. And being kind to one another, which allows the society to function. If I go out every day and start pushing people in the street, or if I refuse to help people that need help, then I'm not building a society around me. it's okay to have an argument. It's okay to feel anger. It's okay to have a fight with your neighbor and so on, because that's normal life. But the thing you're striving for, and this is what, for example, philosophers from the Greco-Roman world, they try to emphasize the concept of virtue. Virtue being, even if you're in a heated debate, don't forget that you're human. Don't forget that the person in front of you is a human being. Okay? The Stoics were very big on virtue. Plato also emphasizes these things. Confucianism, though I've gone to the East, Confucianism is about order, which is very similar to what Shimon is doing. Shimon HaTzadik is trying to create order within the world they're in. Who are we? What are we? So he basically presents the three principles, the Li, Ren, and Sho, which is basically ritual, temple, Ren, very similar to Chasadim, and the Sho, which is studying wisdom. So this first statement that we have in the sayings of a specific sage within the early Judean world is really an establishing shot of who we are supposed to be as Torah keepers. It's not just about having zeal to God, about having zeal to keep the Torah. It's about keeping Torah, acts of Torah, the concept of worship that today would be prayer and things like that, and because we don't have a temple, and acting kindness to one another. These are three things that would make a person a Judean. Today we only have two out of the three. Probably the second one will come back. But these are the three things that, first of all, make you a Judean. And the reason I'm using this term, makes you a Judean, is first of all because if you lived outside of Judea, you didn't have a temple. And second of all, at the time, especially when you go down the road from that point on, definition of who you were, and especially when people were trying to explain who they were. If you are a Jew, it would have meant many, many different things to different people. But if you give a much more precise definition, not just a Jew from Judea, or I'm affiliated with the Judeans, I also do the same practices that they do, I have the same worship that they do, I have the same principles that they have, that makes you a full Judean. So that's the first one that we have. The next Mishnah is by a man called Antigonos Ish Socho. This is actually quite interesting because his name is Hellenistic. As far as I know, he's the only one with a really purely Hellenistic name, even though you can argue maybe Shmayan of Talion later on, but those could be Aramaic names as well. And he seems to be a direct student or someone associated with Shimon HaTzadik. He probably lives, again, in the early Hellenistic era. The fact that he has a Hellenistic name shows that it didn't take very long for Hellenism to take over. This is why putting Shimon HaTzadik as a symbol of fighting Hellenism is anachronistic. And more in truth, they used him as a symbol. They didn't really have a problem with the concept of adopting wisdom from other groups. Changing your name is also not a surprise because we know that the Judeans who lived in Babylon, very quickly, in a matter of a generation or two, started using Babylonian names. And look at the fact that Shashbatzal, Zerubbabel, these are both very, very Babylonian names. So it says, Antigonos Ish Socho, Kibel Mishimon HaTzadik. So he received, the concept of Kabbalah here is to receive oral transmission. In the Talmud, Kabbalah is also used to describe words of prophecy. Kabbalah later on becomes the oral transmission of esoteric teachings, but that's a third stage of how the word is used. So, Kibel Mishimon HaTzadik, Hu Haya Omer, Al tiyu ka'avadim ha'meshamshin et harav al menat lekabel peras, ela hevu ka'avadim ha'meshamshin et harav shelo al menat lekabel peras. V'im ora shamayim alechem. I apologize for the rolling R's. This is how I'm used to reading sometimes. So Antigonos Ish Sochoy. Sochoy is a place. Received from Shimon HaTzadik. He used to say, do not be like servants who serve their master in order to receive a reward. This is a very, very important statement because this actually relates at least in rabbinic thought, to the split within Judaism at the time. There's a background here, but probably not, this is not the case that we're talking about. The way the sages, the way rabbinic sages understood history, they would have leaps within time. They would know one piece of information and try to attach it to something that was 100, 200 years later. The split between the groups in Second Temple Judaism is related to this, but probably started from something else. Let's first of all finish reading. But be like servants who serve their master not for the sake of receiving a reward, and let the fear of heaven be upon you. So first of all, he's not saying there is no reward. The discussion about this is about tzadok and vaitos. So tzadok and vaitos are hypothetical characters of two men who were students of Antigonos Ishsocho, and they heard this and said, "Oh, there's no reward in the after this world, and therefore there's no world, there's no heaven, there's no hell, there's nothing. Everything happens in this world." The development of heaven and hell in Judaism is a response to the fact that there are people who are evil and they have a good life, and people are righteous who suffer in this world. And this is really what Antigonos Ishsocho is trying to deal with. This is a bit of a response to the discussion, for example, in the book of Iyov, in Job. So he says, no matter what your condition is, no matter what your situation is, always serve your master. No matter what the situation is. If you're rich, if you're poor, if you're having a healthy life, if you're suffering, always serve your master properly. Master in this case is Elohim, is God. And no matter what happens with you, always remember, always have the fear of Shamayim. Shamayim here is a way of referencing God. There's a whole sequence of terminology that's used in Judaism, in early stages of Judaism, to avoid using the name. They would use things like Shamayim, Elyon, Kadosh Baruch Hu, Kadosh, and other things as well. There's a very interesting discussion in the book, The Sages by Urbach, which I've recommended many times to people. It's a great book. It's actually, I still have my original copy from 20 years ago. It was published years ago, but I became aware of this book in my very, very early 20s. And I still have my original copy. It is literally one of my favorite books in the world. And I highly recommend it. The Sages, Their World and Philosophy, something like that, by Ephraim Elimelech Urbach. It was translated into English, so it is available. But the original is in Hebrew. And this is really what he's saying. He's dealing with the next stage of being religious. If I'm doing all these things, why is there suffering in the world? Why there's bad in the world? And Antigonos Ishsocho is saying, look, there's no answer to this. You have to focus on what your duty is. It's very, actually I would argue, very samurai-like, very Confucius-like. You need to do what is your duty. Beyond that, you don't have to ask questions. Now again, this is a difficult philosophy for modern day people, because some of us say, well, I have to know. But in truth, even modern day philosophers, the realistic philosophers, not the ones who bellyache with postmodernistic ideas, but the ones who understand the world, say, look, there are things in the world that are what they are. You just have to learn to accept that. Don't push too hard. This is different than, say, for example, Nietzsche, who said you have to grab a hold of the world and do what you need to do. Don't be passive. Nietzsche is a bit of an extreme example, but his point is don't be passive, which means don't sit around and expect things to happen. No, be active, but if something happens, accept it as is, which is very difficult for us as human beings, especially if you have control issues. If you're obsessive about controlling things, then it's a nightmare to live like that. So, first of all, he points out altruistic service. Now, I'm using a modern day term because I couldn't find something something close enough to this. But the altruistic service and reverence over transaction. When we keep Torah, we need to do it wholeheartedly. To do it not because we want to gain the great blessing that God has promised us. This is, by the way, the kind of different than what the Torah says. In the Torah it says, you get your blessing here, there's a promise that if you keep the covenant, you'll be blessed, and so on. A lot of modern day scholars say so. Antigonos Ish is moving away from the Deuteronomy way of thinking, and I point this out in one of the slides. Okay, but I would say the fact that the Deuteronomy says Tamim Tihiyeh Adonai Elohecha, you be to be unblemished with the Lord your God. I can't remember exactly where that verse is, but you can probably find it very easily. Is actually this: do what God has commanded you without any blemish. Just do it. And this is what Antigonos Ish is saying. So we have here some of the historical background. The assumption is that he lived somewhere around the 3rd century, and he is. There is a reference here to the early sectarian development. By the way, I will attach this to the video, so you'll be able to also download these slides. Okay, and this is the point I was referring to. His statement marks an early Jewish challenge to the Deuteronomic ideas of divine reward and punishment, Deuteronomy 28, because there it's all in the physical world, which promised prosperity for obedience and suffering for disobedience. Those who've ever studied the book of Deuteronomy from an academic perspective know that Deuteronomy is describing an ideal. There's an ideal of how things should work, but they don't work that way. And this is what Antigonos Ish is trying to balance out. The same way as the book of Iyov. There are things beyond us that we have no control. The basic idea is that when you keep the Torah and you do God's will, you should be blessed. But this doesn't always work out. And he says, no matter what the reason is, and there are those who eventually try to find answers. There's something in the world. It's a time of anger in the entire world, or something ancestral, something hidden that you don't know about. And eventually, Kabbalah is something you did in a previous life. Whatever the argument is, Antigonos Ish is very, very down to earth, and he says the world is what it is. And you have to accept things as they are. And it's very difficult. For those of you who know, my father passed away. It took me, still taking me time to accept the fact that he died. Why did he have to die? But on the other hand, that's the way of the world. That's the thing that is helping me work through this. As weird as it might sound, it just is the way of the world. You know, I was talking with one of my students this week, and I'm pretty sure listening right now, they lost a parent as well 17 years ago, if I remember correctly. And when we talked, it was obvious that it's the way of the world. It's still difficult even years later, but it's the way of the world, which was a very comforting thing for me to hear from them as well. So there is some comparison to philosophies like Zeno of Citium. People write Citium, but it's Citium. He held that virtue is the center of everything, which is absolutely true. Plato has his concept of justice as well in the Republic. It's worthwhile reading the Republic. It's a very, very important book to read. And he says, Socrates argues, I have a mistake here. Plato's concept of justice, and for some reason I wrote Socrates. Sorry, it should be Plato. Argues that justice should be pursued for its own sake. By the way, it's a common thing in lectures as well, where the slides are not right, and for some reason I have Socrates here. It should be Plato. Justice should be pursued for its own sake, not for its benefits. It's very virtuous. It's very difficult to do, but it's true. Apikolos is a bit of a funny person to mention here within this context, because Tzedok and Baitos were declared apikosim. They say there's no reward and so on. Everything happens in this world, and then bringing apikolos here into this is, but Apikoros was actually much more complicated. Though he's associated with pleasure seeking, which is exactly what the Tzadok and Baitos are accused of, he actually emphasizes that the true happiness comes from virtue and limiting fear. including fear of divine punishment. When you serve God not out of fear of punishment, so looking at it from the other angle, don't do it because you might be punished, okay? Or do these things because you might be punished. He also objects to that. You have to. This is the most important thing here. He did seek pleasure, and some people claim Nietzsche was like this as well, even though he probably wasn't. But to bring apikoros here is very, very important because he also gives us the other end of things. Do it because you're supposed to do it. No matter if you look at it from the positive or the negative, no matter what your outlook is, do it because you need to do it. Do it because it's the right thing to do. Do it because it's the thing that balances the world, if I do a way of looking at it from Confucius. I hope you enjoyed this format. I think the slideshow actually gives more information. It's better to see my face and talking and so on. And if you have any questions, ideas, comments about what I just described, even though I think it's very straightforward, some of these points, it gets more complicated as we continue in the Mishnayot themselves. But the thing I recommend is to meditate about this even further. Always think about it. This is why, for example, Marcus Aurelius' book is called Meditations, Thoughts to Himself. Maybe you want to keep a notebook where you write some of the idea, go back to the idea and write it down, and then think about it more and write more points. I recommend keeping a page for each point because it probably will expand as you go. And I might have other thoughts about this. This is why I also have to limit myself. My format is to try to explain the basic meaning of what's being said, what is the philosophy behind it, and maybe compare it to things in the ancient world. This might not always be the format, but right now, for this stage, it's the best format I can think of. So I hope you enjoyed this, and please join me again in the future. Kol tov.